Well, good day, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Agile Quality Strategy with HP Agile Manager. You can go ahead and flip it to the next slide, please. This webinar is brought to you by HP, and I will actually be your host today. Just a little bit of background information on me. My name is Matt Anger. I'm a Senior Solution Architect for Results Positive, an award-winning HP Partner of the Year. I work closely with client organizations to recommend, design, and implement ALM solutions that often incorporate HP enterprise products like HP ALM, Agile Manager, and UFT. I've been featured in a few industry-leading publications, such as Software Test Professional magazine, for topics around SAP regression testing and leading user acceptance testing teams over $1 million. I was educated at Penn State University, Smeal College of Business, and I've been working with HP products since the late 90s. I'm an HP Expert 1 certified professional and also a certified Scrum Master. For more information about Results Positive, you can point your browser to www.resultspositive.com. We are a platinum partner of HP and often help clients with the integration of ALM with Agile Manager. And this is our presenter for today, Matthew Brailer-Berger. He's an ALM and Quality Product Marketing Manager with HP. Matt has over 18 years of experience in software architecture, project management, development, and quality. Matthew currently works within HP Software as a product marketing manager for the application lifecycle and quality solutions. He has worked as a trusted advisor to HP's enterprise clients, field teams, and product management as the practice manager for the American Field Organization. He also worked at Borland Software as an Agile evangelist and at IBM Rational, where he began his career as a practitioner and a consultant, working with large clients in the telecommunications and government sectors. Matt's also a certified Scrum Master and also certified Safe Agile Program Consultant. He attended the University of Ottawa and currently resides in Chicago, where he spends much of his free time playing hockey as part of the Chicago Redliners. Just a few housekeeping items before turning it over to Matt. Today's live session is intended for all Vivid members. The recording will be posted in the webinar section on the Vivid website, visible for all members. Additionally, today's slide deck and webinar recording will be made available to you. We will send you a link via email once they are posted to the Vivid website. And if you have questions as we go along, please go ahead and type them in and send the questions in the webinar control panel. We'll address them at the end. And here's a quick picture of the GoToWebinar control panel that you should see on your right-hand side. To submit a question, make sure the questions pane is expanded and type in your question and click on send. So let's get started. I'm going to go ahead and pass this over to Matt.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So, I guess I apologize in advance if I sound a little groggy or anything like that today. It's one of those heavy coffee days. Matt mentioned earlier I play hockey, and actually our team won the city championship late last night, so it was one of those late nights. So, but this is an exciting topic, actually. I think this is amazing. I love talking Agile. I love talking about our technology. And I think when you look at the industry as a whole, there's so many different changes going on with respect to time to market, and I think we're still trying to figure out, again, as an industry, what some of these best practices ultimately are, and that's not abnormal in the software space, certainly. What we're going to focus on today is talking about HP Agile Manager. We're looking at actually how we can maybe embrace some of these various changes, understand that change is the only constant we're going to have, but that we can embrace it to make things better, we can deliver better solutions. Now, there is certainly some product stuff that we'll talk about here. You can certainly do Agile without products. A lot of organizations do that. I would argue as you get into the larger enterprises or even the mid-sized organization, the right technologies ultimately become the most helpful thing to help the team focus on doing the right things, and especially as you start to deal with larger quantities of data, how to be able to get metrics out of that, how to effectively share, and how to work with other teams. And just as a quick overview of the agenda here, we'll start off just talking some of the observations and the recommendations that we've seen and we've observed our successful customers going through. And again, the Agile transformation, a lot of organizations, I'd argue pretty much everybody out there is at least experimenting with the concept of Agile, if not already using significant quantities of Agile methods on their projects. But there are ways that it works and there are ways that it doesn't necessarily work. And I think it's understanding that it is a journey that's very important to any organization. Actually, I was at the DevOps Day conference yesterday here in Chicago, which is, again, ongoing today. And just watching that next evolution in the marketplace is really important. And again, the technology required to be able to support that does become very critical. And so I will talk about the Agile Manager product. I'll talk about specifically how it works with things like quality management. That's one of the challenges we're starting to see evolve in the Agile space. Now, perhaps it's a little self-serving because we do have a very strong quality bias within HP through Mercury and so forth. But it is one of the things that we start to see as organizations and time to market and business pressures things to get released far more quickly. We are starting to see quality begin to suffer, and ironically when quality is most critical out there. And so we seem to be making interesting trade-offs right now in the marketplace, and we'll talk about some of the ways that we propose to be able to help that. I'll talk about Agile Manager also being one of those roadmaps to doing DevOps. Now, DevOps, first and foremost, and I throw Agile in the same sort of bucket, is always more about culture than it is about technology. Now, certainly there's automation pieces that are sort of required for DevOps, but there's this concept that they were talking about actually yesterday at the DevOps days that I thought really plays so well to Agile in general. It's really bringing the idea of empathy into the process, and that's where the cultural piece starts to come in. It's understanding what those other people within your supply and delivery chain ultimately have to go through when we're actually working together on the project teams to get things released. I'll talk about Scale Agile Framework, and we'll do some Q&A at the end here. So as we start off here, again, these are just some of the things that we're observing as we look at our successful organizations. And again, we're very fortunate with HP and certainly through our Vivid partnership to have access to tons and tons of customers out there doing things, many thousands of customers using our technologies today, potentially even millions of users if you look at it that way. A lot of the data that we use, and this is always very interesting, so every year for the last number of years, Capgemini through Sogeti, working with HP, does this World Quality Report. When they survey thousands of IT respondents, in this case, this example I'm showing here is 1,221 respondents to this question, and just ask things about quality, ask things about Agile, ask things about development, and it's asking different sized organizations, it's asking executives, it's asking practitioners, and a lot of the stuff we'll talk about, this is where some of these recommendations or these observations primarily begin to come from, but we're seeing that observed firsthand when I'm actually meeting with customers and I'm working with folks, and certainly when I was doing a lot of consulting work in the past. These are things that we're just starting to see in the marketplace, and I thought it was interesting to kind of talk about this because, again, a lot of people talk about what Agile is and how to go to Agile, but it's not necessarily as clear how to do it properly, what some of the pitfalls might potentially be. We have an infographic up here, and it's a bit large, we'll say. You can get more information on this if you go to hp.com/go/quality center. There's a link on there as well. We'll also post some of the stuff in any of the follow-up. But out of some of the stuff that we're observing from customers, in particular out of this World Quality Report for this year, and actually we're in the process of going through the surveys for the 2015-2016 report, no surprise, mobile's huge. I think we all realize that. It's probably the first time in many, many years where we're actually seeing new project money allocated for new initiatives in organizations. But mobile also demands a very different approach. It demands very different users. And the experience has to be very, very critical. And so what we're starting to see actually based on some of the statistics is that not enough time to test is really the largest challenge that organizations face. And that's not terribly surprising when you look at the complexity of doing things like mobile. Now, even web apps still suffer from significant amount of work that has to be done in order to ensure quality, but mobile takes something that could have been very, very complex and makes it hilariously more complex by adding thousands of potential combinations. Actually, FD Times posted something very interesting this morning about Android market fragmentation and the fact that there's about 800 different versions of Android around the world, which becomes a nightmare as if you're trying to actually guarantee quality, because weird bugs is that whole concept of the ghost in the machine. Unexpected behavior, unpredicted behavior begins to evolve when you have these complex environments, and that's why we do a lot of these testing functions, whether it's load testing, functional testing, and so forth, just to make sure that if I go to these weird configurations, that things aren't going to go crazy or that we're not going to open up vulnerabilities in our application. Now, the good news is we are starting to see through these reports, and actually in our customers, even though more testing is sort of the problem that organizations have, they want more, we are seeing more budget allocated to do this. More interestingly enough, and this was very surprising to me initially, because I'd say I'm pragmatic in my view of Agile, in that Agile, pure Agile, if you think about Scrum, talks about the concept that there really isn't this idea of having different role definitions on the team. You're part of the team, you're cross-functional, you should just figure it out. And I'm oversimplifying that, of course. But the idea is, as we start to talk to customers and as we start to look at especially middle-sized and large-sized organizations, even the lines of business within them, the actual share of testing being done by the developers is starting to decrease. And by testing, we're talking things performance testing, functional, even acceptance testing. Unit testing is always big in the development space. But what we're starting to see evolve is this concept of a tester as a role on an Agile team. And this isn't unique, and we're not certainly claiming ownership of that concept, but what we're starting to see is a lot of customers are beginning to just include one of those, 7 to 10 people on the Scrum team, for example, focus just on testing. Maybe they're shared across the other team members, they're focusing on developing architecture, they're focusing on where we can automate. And automation is one of those things, as I'll talk in a second here, that we're seeing large organizations or even middle-sized organizations adopting in order to deal with velocity, especially in the Agile space. You kind of have to at a certain level. Specifically, if you look at some of the mobile stuff, there's no way anybody has the time to test these hundreds of potential core combinations of phones and operating systems and so forth to do that. So again, we're sort of a call out here. I think the tester still, as a role, gets maybe not the respect that they deserve, more lately than they used to, for sure. But especially in the Agile space, our data is beginning to show that testing is not only just critical, but so critical for teams that the role is becoming specialized. Now, we've been cautioning everybody when we talk to our customers, don't go through the process of ripping these testers out and putting them into a central organization. Maybe you can from the purposes of knowledge sharing, and Scaled Agile, I think, talks to that to some degree, but they need to be directly core on that actual team where they're serving that function. And so they may focus on testing, but they're part of that Scrum team. They're not an adjunct resource that we bring in every now and then. They need to be part of those daily discussions. They need to be a part of the architecture work. They need to be doing a whole bunch of other stuff to help everybody course correct. And I think that's in line with some of that empathy messaging that I was hearing through some of the DevOps folks yesterday at the DevOps days. So just some of the high-level observations again here. QA budgets do continue to rise. This is excellent news. Not surprising again, because our users, and I say this sort of tongue-in-cheek, I suppose, our users of our products are becoming far more, well, I'll say they're less tolerant to any of the bugs or errors. We have people who are almost at a level of attention deficit disorder where we're going to drop an app after a couple of seconds if it's not performing. And yeah, again, whether that's good behavior or not for the end user, that is the reality we have to work in. And so what it means is if I'm not solving the problem efficiently or quickly, another company is going to probably step in and do that. We are seeing that all team members are sharing a responsibility in testing. And again, True Agile is going to push the concept of unit testing being critical, acceptance testing, regression testing, and so forth. But it is becoming a very core conversation on the team. And again, small teams, small companies, smaller organizations certainly have the flexibility of having, I'll call it agility to do more of these things a little bit more effectively, if I can overuse that term. But the idea is in the middle of the larger organizations where there is that regimented process and there's a lot more of a hurdle to move to true, quote-unquote, cross-functional Agile, having that specialized role is becoming incredibly important. And again, again, I'm going to call out the Scaled Agile folks quite positively here because they talk about architecture not just evolving on its own organically. Very large systems don't have just architecture that evolves. Architecture is one of those things that needs to be intentionally planned, and that's why things like SAFe talk about actually adding an architect to the Agile release train and things like that. And again, we're huge supporters of that technology or that concept. Going even further, maybe saying that testing and automation should fit into that as well. Interestingly enough, virtualization, if organizations, if you're on this and you haven't really looked into virtualization for maybe services, maybe for the network, maybe for different parts of your technology, that is one of the secrets that we're seeing yielding huge results for some of these organizations. The hardest time to do a performance test, for example, is going to be very early in that system if we have only a small portion of that architecture together. It's very difficult to stand up enough of that system to get truly meaningful performance testing done early in the process. So funny thing is that you wait later in that process, performance testing in particular becomes incredibly expensive to correct. And that's actually where we're starting to see this idea of cleansing sprints or sprint overruns or stabilization sprints to be able to correct this stuff. It's because some of these testing capabilities are done very late in that process. And again, we're not saying that that's the worst way to do it. Ultimately, in Agile, if the team is able to be functional and that works for you, then that's a great way to do it. But we are observing virtualization as one of those secret items that's helping some of these organizations deal with testing earlier in that process. And again, that feeds nicely to the next point, because the organizations still do struggle with testing in the sprint. And of course, mid to large organizations, if you work at any large organization now, metrics don't disappear. And I always thought that was comical, maybe 10 years ago or so, when the enterprise started toying with the idea of going Agile, that some of the first projects would be pretty bold, at least in some of the organizations I was observing, and saying that, well, we're Agile, we don't do metrics. We have velocity charts, but our primary progress metric is executable code. Interesting concept, and I certainly don't disagree with that, but telling some vice president or some MBA person who's got a ton of experience, understands the business very well, that I'm just not going to give you those metrics that you're used to getting, doesn't often create the best conversations initially, and especially if your organization's beginning to go Agile and you don't have metrics, a lot of organizations stumble initially. And no metrics means that it really freaks people out. And I think that enough folks may have been through that at this point in their careers watching this to be able to at least see some of that. Again, the faster pace of delivery is going to demand that we get this right the first time. The cost of actual failure is huge. I mean, I've seen examples, and we all can probably cite examples of large retailers maybe coming down on Black Friday, or big organizations advertising during the Super Bowl, only to find out that when people start to hit their application, things break or things don't work as intended. And so quality is one of those things that is deliberately architected into the product. And again, that may be a quote-unquote no-duh to anybody who's actually doing Agile successfully today, but as you think about this in larger organizations where you do have regimented process and distinct roles and HR paths for people on the team and so forth, it's very, very difficult to get true cross-functionality right out of the gate. And so quality is one of those ways to actually embrace people who may not be able to code as effectively as everybody else on the team, but can still add a lot of value because they understand the business, they understand how to look at the end user's perspective and so forth. So some of the recommendations, again, these are things that we are observing from our customers. It may not be earth-shattering to everybody here, but certainly I think worth calling out. Don't turn your sprint into a mini waterfall. I mean, I suppose if you're completing the work within the sprint, that's okay. But again, the goal isn't to lay out your overall release strategy into just smaller iterative type chunks. In true Agile, of course, we want to be able to completely finish something within the context of a sprint as best as possible. And there's always asterisks around that, depending on how organizations have adapted to that, of course, because Agile is more about the philosophy of empowerment and giving end users the ability to do repeatable things. Shift left, though, is one of those other things that we're starting to see becoming very critical. This whole idea of DevOps, we want people to ultimately be some level of cross-functional on the team, but we also want people on the development team to be able to talk deployment. And again, large organizations like Netflix or Orbitz or Expedia or things like that, these organizations that have gone and embraced DevOps significantly will release 40, 50 times a day because there's an automation framework and there's a process and a culture that supports that. We have a piece of technology within our software offering called Quality Center and Application Lifecycle Management called ALI. HP loves acronyms, but the idea is Application Lifecycle Intelligence. It's a way to connect the development and build environment to user stories or to the test functionality itself. And this really helps us understand where to test. If I can understand what code has changed, what builds have been done, what's been introduced into the system, yeah, best testing practices, I should test everything consistently so that I can alleviate unexpected behavior. But in a pinch, code quality or looking at what's been actually delivered helps me at least pare down what I should test if I'm being compressed. We do need people to focus on automation and testing as a core architecture because automation just is one way to manage the content. There's so much stuff, and I hear this time and time again, especially on newer Agile teams. It's very difficult to manage the quantity of things that you get later into the life cycle. Your regression test suite will grow. Your unit testing suite, even if you're migrating it or connecting it together to your regression suite, gets big, and performance testing gets big, and then you add security testing to this, and it becomes very challenging for organizations to deal with the minutia of this. And again, there's all sorts of ifs, ands, or buts based on every organization. As they say, your mileage may vary, but these are some of the things that we're observing in our customers, including the idea of using a backlog management tool. I've done Agile with just the no cards on the board, and it works pretty well. Challenging, again, in organizations that are very metrics focused or may have people who are geographically distributed, because that's just the way the company is. Backlog management tools are great for that. Now, our ideal picture, I was talking about not trying to keep the testing, keeping everything within that same sprint. Our ideal picture is emerging within organizations that are successful, this concept of continuous testing. The more frequently you can test stuff, the earlier you can test stuff, and this has been true forever in software, the cheaper it's going to be ultimately to correct errors. This is the whole concept behind continuous integration in general. Is if I'm forcing the system to get broken many times a day, that course correction or the deviation required to get me back on track is smaller and smaller each time. I'm spending less time paying money to build something and then paying money to unbuild it and then build it again, if that delta is much smaller by doing this in a regular interval. Similar to the testing space, if we can actually expand the concept of continuous integration and actually bring in continuous testing, so I'm maybe running automated testing suites, maybe I'm even doing cucumber test or something at the end of my build process, I'm able to continually address this quality issue much earlier in that process. Throw performance testing, I would argue, in there as well. If performance is incredibly critical to applications. There are, oddly enough, some applications I've seen at some clients where performance is a nice to have, but it's not critical. Again, I'd argue in our current business climate and getting things out there as quickly as possible with as high as quality as possible, performance is pretty critical to everybody, but again, your mileage will vary. But even in the performance space, being able to test some of those core architectural pieces earlier in that life cycle is going to yield much, much better results for everybody. You're likely to be able to do more stories later because you're spending less time dealing with technical debt. So I'll get in and talk about HP Agile Manager. I want to make sure I'm saving time for questions at the end here as well. So I'm going to just breeze through this here. So we have a piece of technology. It's a few years old now. It felt newer last year, but that's maybe because it was relatively new. But very, very strong adoption, probably our fastest growing product within the portfolio right now, helping organizations do backlog management, helping organizations connect into the development and build environment. But our technology also has two core integrations that very few other products in the space, I argue really nobody, but that's never 100% true. We integrate very well with test management tools like Quality Center or Application Lifecycle Management from HP. We also integrate very well with our project and portfolio management tool. That's always, again, depending on the organization, a pretty critical piece if you're a larger company, but maybe not as critical, the project and portfolio management piece, if you're a smaller company. But the idea of being able to understand what was my resource availability, what's my cost? If I'm sharing people between projects, how is that resource utilized? And there's aspects of that I can do natively in Agile Manager, as you see here. But again, depending on the size of the organization, being able to connect that into the portfolio management system is very critical to keeping some of those metrics working inside your environment today, where they're desired, of course. So what is HP Agile Manager as a technology? It's a web-based tool. It could be deployed on-premise if you need it, but primarily it's hosted by HP in a SaaS environment. It really helps organizations understand and get visibility into what's going on in your Agile world. So there's backlog management. You'll see there's sprint management, release management. Again, one of the unique things that we do is connect into your Jenkins system or your source control management system so that as users are in their IDE, and some of the developers may rarely go into Agile Manager, they may participate by working inside Visual Studio or inside Eclipse. We have a plugin for both of those environments. As they begin to change or commit code, it's connecting that back to articles of work or user stories or tasks or defects that I'm actually referencing inside of Agile Manager. So I can not only understand, what's Matt doing today, what did he last week, but we can look back and say, well, why does this defect keep popping up? What lines of code or who's worked on this? Or more importantly, we just broke the build during our CI process. What was the change that was introduced? Not necessarily the code. It's sometimes helpful to know the code. And that's always often very, very helpful because you got to correct the code. But having the additional context of why was that code change made really helps with some of that detective work in uncovering this. Now again, if you're building very, very regularly, these deltas are much smaller, and so it's maybe less of an issue, but that visibility and the metrics become critical to understanding how the team progresses. Again, we look at all of our customers. I don't even know, even with an HP, I don't know any organization company-wide, we'll say, that is truly 100% within any of these specific areas. Either you're only waterfall, you're only agile, or you're only using Visual Studio, or you're only using Java, or you're only using whatever, R or PHP or something else. There's some level of heterogeneousness in every single environment that I've seen out there with customers, whether it's different tools, different processes, different languages, and so forth. And our key in what we're offering here, connecting Agile Manager to HP ALM, HP Quality Center, is being able to help unify a lot of that data. So we're not forcing organizations or different project teams who are already proficient in a tool to change and come over to Agile Manager. We can connect to some of those environments. We can begin to build holistic metrics. I can share defects. I can understand what the code coverage is and things like that across a much larger spectrum than I have visibility to do today. And that's, again, very seldom have I run across a company where you're only in one stack. And so getting correlated metrics across all these different technologies, especially if you're a manager, can be very, very challenging. And fundamentally, if you don't have that visibility to your metrics, it's very difficult to make any process change. It's very difficult to understand how people are being utilized. And again, there are ways, of course, in Agile where we can assess true progress, but it's harder sometimes to connect that back to cost and some of the financial parts that need to be considered when we look at the business angles behind that. So just a quick screenshot here, and you'll see a few more in just a moment here, what HP Agile Manager actually looks like. I'm a huge fan of this graph here, the build summary. That was when I started working in telcos, our builds were huge and would take hours. And I guess I have that weird kick I get from having to go and debug builds in my past. So having some sort of a technology that can very quickly look into what was in that build without forcing process change. And that's the key in any technology, is you don't force the team to do something that's completely orthogonal to the work that they should already be doing, because then people don't remember to do it, and then your metrics aren't really valuable if people forget to put them in there. But having this kind of a build support and development level support, I wish I had it 15 years ago, 20 years ago, quite frankly. But again, very, very quick view into what Agile Manager is doing here. It's Agile project management, traditional release, user story, defect management, really helping teams at the actual project level, but also at the much larger organizational level do certain pieces of Agile management functionality without forcing the developer to remember to come into a tool, or forcing the Scrum Master to remember to go into a certain tool to do something. You're doing work in wherever your environment is most close to your job or what you're delivering. So if you're a developer, you're probably in your IDE. If you're a manager, maybe you are in here, or a Scrum Master, you might be inside Agile Manager directly. We're capturing these metrics from wherever the practitioner is working. And I would argue the metrics become very actionable at that point, because it's more likely, if I'm representing the work that's being delivered, not for the big brother effect, but to be able to understand what the team is doing, than it is to say, well, remember to put your time card in, or remember to go do this. Well, people forget. We're busy. We have 100 other things we have to work on. So then how reliable do metrics become in an environment like that? I'd argue not very. We are a Scaled Agile Gold partner, so we've embraced SAFe quite heavily here. I'm a big SAFe proponent. Actually, I'm a program consultant myself, and actually when I saw the first inklings of this years ago, I was incredibly excited, because I was hoping for something like this to happen in the Agile world. If you're not familiar with Scaled Agile, scaledagile.com, fantastic way of taking Agile to a larger enterprise environment. They've got tons and tons of great success stories around that. But again, as I mentioned earlier, we also have a synchronizer for our technology that relates into the quality world and into project and portfolio management. I've got a screenshot here. You can see it's animating as it's moving things through my task board. In this case here, it's basically moving through the different states of my work. And I can adjust all of these as I need to. So I can rename things and add certain states if I choose to do that. But there's this concept of we call it the definition of done, and this is a pretty unique thing within our technology. Being able to define what it is to be actually completed, and actually I had the example up here, and I don't think I do quite yet, When I drag something on my task board into completed, part of that definition of done is going to be, the system will ask me, well, first of all, have you done X, Y, Z? Are these the ways that you validated? Is it part of your quality process? Are we looking at test case coverage, for example, to do that? Is it logging to make sure there's no defects? Have I completed subordinate tasks? That sort of thing. And I'll have this an example coming up a little bit more about how we manage this idea of the definition of done. But it is something that we've very intentionally put inside the technology here to make the team very aware that you're running towards a goal. If we can clarify what that end goal looks like and make sure everybody's aware of it, when the team develops and builds things, we're generally running towards that end goal, and that's this whole concept behind the definition of done. So some other examples here, release management, of course, as well. So we have the task board. We have the ability to do storyboard analysis, as well as you would expect just pure regular backlog management. I'll show some examples of that in a minute. But fundamentally, if you're looking at what we're doing in Agile Manager, we do release planning. So we're actually defining our teams. Teams can have shared members across multiple teams. So for example, if I've got a performance tester that is core to my projects, but being shared because maybe there's certain times when I can have those resources on project A versus project B, that can be managed inside here. If Matt, for example, is going away next week for 2 days on vacation, that can be tracked inside here as far as our velocity or how we can actually assign work. Sprint planning, of course, allows us to get to the much more granular minutia of what's going on, how to assign work directly to a team or teams. And so if I have this concept of an epic, which may be what we call maybe a theme or a feature, how do I break that out? How do I assign those subordinate pieces to various teams? How do I follow that throughout its life cycle, which plays very nicely in the sprint execution piece, the implementation work, being able to take a user story and break it into tasks, being able to manage a defect as a separate entity. Again, some organizations don't recognize a defect as a separate item. They just classify, and again, it depends on how you do Agile, classify a defect as just it's a user story that's not done. And so the user story just doesn't get assigned done because we have a problem assigned against it. I would argue it's much easier for a lot of organizations adopting Agile to track defects as separate entities. That's how we set it up out of the box inside Agile Manager. Of course, you can do lots of customizations inside Agile Manager as you need to. What we've also got is, as you're going through the execution process, and I'll show some examples here in a second, at the retrospective part, when you're finishing up the sprint, we can actually look at some of the work that wasn't assigned or completed, and either we can assign to-do items, we can maybe push some of those user stories into a future sprint, we can put it back on the backlog, and there's certain ways we can categorize some of the feedback that may have happened as a result of that, so we can reuse some of those lessons learned moving forward. The really big reason, now again, as a practitioner, Agile Manager is certainly a very helpful tool because it helps us organize the work that we're trying to do, helps us understand what I should be focusing on. But there's a ton of value ultimately that comes out from this visibility and the insight, being able to understand at the executive level, at even the Scrum Master level, what velocity is. And there's about 60 or so out-of-the-box reports and graphs that we can have inside of Agile Manager, as well as the ability to create your own. But it's really the data and the metrics that becomes very critical. Now, I'm old school pragmatist will say I'm not a big fan of managing purely by metrics. Metrics are helpful, but I'm not a big fan of managing purely by a chart or a spreadsheet because they don't always tell the whole story. They're very helpful, though. And a lot of the stuff that we have in here, because, again, we're not forcing process change because we're gathering our metrics by basically listening in and auditing the work that's being done by our teams already, they become very actionable. It's not as much a, oh, that's cool, kind of a metric, but things I can actually reorient my team. I can have much more serious conversations about our capacity, about the work that people are actually doing in real time. It fosters good conversations, actually. There's a number of our customers who just put up things like our task board or our storyboard during their actual stand-up meetings as a way to sort of anchor the team on the work that's being done. Our developer analytics ecosystem, this thing called Application Lifecycle Intelligence, again, HP with our acronyms here, ALI, very, very broad and growing. So there's a number of different IDEs. So we just added the SAP and IntelliJ very recently. We've done Visual Studio and Eclipse for a while. This just basically takes user stories and defects that I'm working on and just makes it visible to me as a list of tasks assigned to me as a user within the IDE itself. So as a developer, I don't need to go and flip between tools. It just sits in one of those panes or one of the perspective panes inside of Eclipse, for example. Number of different FCM systems. Again, we're not forcing organizations to adopt one of these. If you've got an SCM system out there, it's pretty easy for us to generally just listen and audit what's going on. And again, the key is we start to assign things like branch and version IDs to a user story or to a defect. And so when those actual branches or version numbers appear in the build, because Jenkins, for example, is calling out to Git to actually build something off of the trunk version number 5, we know, okay, well, the build includes user story 6, which was to fix the login screen or add a new user login screen or something to that effect. We also have unit test integration and code coverage integration as well. And there'll be a whole bunch of stuff coming in the future around that kind of stuff. I won't get too much more into that, at least for this conversation here. Now, the next level, of course, is so Agile Manager is our technology. DevOps seems to be the hot thing going on right now. Every couple of years or so, we get these buzzwords that happen in the marketplace. And I think DevOps is very real. It is a journey, much longer journey for organizations than purely Agile. But the foundation for being able to do effective DevOps, I would argue, starts with some tools like an Agile Manager as a backlog management or project management technology. Because we need to understand some of these metrics. We need to be able to integrate with other parts of the system, of course, as builds happen and as defects are introduced or as unit testing and regression testing are done. What does that mean to our overall quality story? Our environment, Agile Manager, you can see at the very bottom. And again, this is a bit of an eye chart on purpose, just to show that there is a level of complexity that we can fit in. The best user story, if I kind of sum this out for anybody who is maybe checking their glasses right now and wondering why the font is so small in this stuff, think about delivering a new user story. So I'm as a developer, I update the user interface to add a login screen, for example. That gets into the continuous integration process, so it gets put out into the source control system, gets committed, Jenkins comes in, builds it, maybe runs a regression test against it. This is, again, our perfect world ideal scenario. Organizations are doing this, by the way. That regression test could also include automated testing, automated functional testing. And so we can call out to one of the technologies, HP's technology as an example, called CODAR, which effectively works to provision some of those test lab environments, works with Quality Center to be able to execute those tests, being able to pull those results of the test back in through Quality Center into Agile Manager and so forth, maybe working with other deployment tools further down the chain. But this idea of a round trip, I can check in work, it gets pushed through the process and delivered automatically, tested, staged, and so forth. Very real, and that's where a lot of the technology and the automation starts to come in. But more fundamentally, it's got to start off with some ways for me to manage my tasks. I would argue, it might be interesting to see if we get any questions around this, I don't know how you could do DevOps without a fairly decent chunk of tools. It doesn't necessarily have to be vendor tools. I mean, open source certainly works, but you might be able to do Agile without technology. Even geographically distributed Agile, I've seen work with webcams and people having cameras on boards and things like that. But it's very difficult in the DevOps world fundamentally because DevOps is about automating the deployment process to do it without tools. But we've got to start first and foremost with what are we actually delivering. And that's where Agile Manager begins that first part of that journey. So I'll talk just very briefly here about the synchronization process. And then I'll make sure, again, we're leaving room for questions here. But Agile Manager, really what HP's process is, we've got technology that supports the individual practitioner, but that communicates also to be able to build that higher level story. And so Agile Manager is a very lightweight environment where our teams can actually focus in an Agile-like world. As you saw, I've got task boards and all sorts of release backlogs and defect management things and stuff of that sort. Quality Center and ALM traditionally are for, we call them more iterative project teams, and then for the quality-focused teams. There is a synchronization between the two. A lot of organizations, if you're trying to share things like defects between your Agile teams and your iterative teams, this becomes an easy way to be able to facilitate that. I can see that same record on both sides, understand the status on both sides of that integration, but I'm not encumbered with this massive tool that we have to remember to work within. I can work in the technology that supports my workflow, that's geared towards the things that I want to do, so it's easier for me and I'm much more proficient in that environment. And so Quality Center and ALM are really helping focus on the testing or the iterative project space, Agile Manager helping on the Agile space, but we still synchronize things like requirements, test and defect data, and of course the release and metric information as well, so I can get this overall view of my environment. Now again, at the project level, I probably don't care a whole lot what my metrics look like to my manager, but my manager probably does care. So again, some of the ideas here, it's basically a real-time synchronization. It's not a thing you have to buy. It comes with Agile Manager itself, but it's a way to be able to facilitate and sync things. Pretty easy to set up and configure this stuff. Pretty easy to monitor what's going on inside this environment. It just, again, helps make sure that communication is clear across the entire team, regardless of what your environment is. You can see some just quick screenshots here showing an Agile Manager. By the way, this is what your backlog view might look like for your release or your sprint backlog. I have a number of my actual user stories in here, and you can see something called the direct cover status, which is letting me know in the Quality Center world, has this test actually been run? Does a test maybe not exist for this user story? It may not be a one-to-one mapping. One test may actually satisfy many user stories, or one user story may have multiple tests. Maybe either side of that certainly works in our environment here, but the key is that when the testers are working in their environment geared towards their functionality, their work is automatically transitioned into where the Agile teams can actually look at this. Or maybe it's someone on the Agile team and you're talking about this during your stand-up. But in any effect, this stuff is being categorized. I have metrics on this. I can understand progress. I can begin to create reports. Again, on the other side, in the ALM world, you see that similar view of the data itself. We're actually transmitting a lot of the user story and defect information into Quality Center or HP ALM to be able to see this as well, including, you can see, of course, test coverage. Again, setting it up inside Agile Manager, pretty simple. A lot of this stuff, Agile Manager is one of those products that we basically invented out of thin air. And I love it when our R&D folks come up with these new products because it's just incredible to see the level of innovation they're capable of. But it changed a lot of the usability for many of our other products because of how easy and how streamlined and modern that user interface looked for Agile Manager when it came out, including even things like synchronization. We're moving away from this, requiring code or requiring scripting to do stuff, and more talking about things like visual workflows, or in this case here, just talking about options and radio buttons that do things behind the scenes. Again, the goal isn't to turn this into an IQ test. The goal is to make the team functional with the technology so I can do the work I'm doing and not spend all the time actually managing the periphery activities so that my executives are happy with what we're doing. I just want to do what I'm doing and have the tool capture this stuff, and that's exactly what we're offering in this environment here. Again, just some screenshots here in Agile Manager and the Synchronizer just showing that there's a mapping between fields and so forth. Again, I would encourage anybody, if there's any remote interest in this at all, take a look at Agile Manager, and there'll be a call to action here at the end just to show you guys how to do that. It is insanely easy to use and set up, and it does scale. I think it's one of the things that we bring as a competitive differentiator into the marketplace. Most of HP's customers are just big, and what's big? Big is subjective, but we've got lots of instances of, for example, ALM and Quality Center where we've got 6,000 to 7,000 users hitting a system pretty regularly. And so we've had to build into that level of scalability. And Agile Manager comes into that same sort of heritage where we have to make sure this scales. And so it's very easy for the team to use it, but as the organization begins to adopt it larger and begin to maybe add more pieces to the puzzle, we do have that enterprise scalability. So we're not going to run into some place where we become so successful with another technology that it grows and then things slow down and people become frustrated with the tool and it completely defeats the purpose of using it to begin with. These tools scale incredibly, incredibly well. Now, speaking of scaling, again, some organizations, I'd argue we're struggling a little bit less now in the industry than we were even maybe a year ago with the concept of taking Agile and realizing that 7 to 10 people isn't really a project for a larger organization. It's a subset probably of a program, or maybe I'm integrating with something that's legacy, maybe I'm integrating with other outside partners and so forth. There's the concept of the Scrum of Scrums in different ways that we've been able to sort of scale Agile, but the scaled Agile framework, I would argue, is probably usually the only framework I've seen of any real value that really takes Agile to the full enterprise, all the way up even to the portfolio level. Fundamentally, if you're not familiar with scaled Agile, it's 3, call them streams, at the team, the program, the portfolio level. It is a recipe book for moving an organization over to doing large-scaled Agile, multiple project teams, even things down to budgeting and doing what we call weighted shortest job first. So actually determining on a project, what is it that we should be doing? What are some of the objective metrics I can apply to the things that my team is going to be developing that is going to get me the biggest bang for the buck. And it's rooted in things like Lean, and of course Scrum, Agile behind it. And Agile Manager supports SAFe. We're a gold SAFe partner. We have this concept of the definition of done, weighted shortest job first, and the ability to actually take some of the things that I think Scaled Agile does so incredibly well, and put it into a technology that makes it consumable for people regardless of geography on a team, but again also funds that very valuable metrics base that gets us that actionable insight into what's actually going in our team itself. And again, we even go further by connecting TPM to this if the organization wants to be able to integrate that into the project portfolio management system. So you can see our mapping is basically teams go to our concept of releases, programs to our concept of an application, and then portfolio to our concept of a workspace. So again, Agile Manager is one of those technologies that you can grow into, and it's intended that way. We don't have to go spend weeks and weeks and weeks configuring the ideal solution. Most of our organizations are productive in the first few days of getting it up. And it's intended that as we begin to adopt and craft and grow our process, we can adjust Agile Manager to do different things on the fly, including scaling, as we begin to scale the organization up. That was always the challenge, I think, in a lot of organizations, is as things become very successful in one group, how does that transition to the larger organization, such that we don't lose the value that we initially intended. Again, you can see the examples here, a screenshot showing our weighted shortest job first, which is a very critical metric within Scaled Agile for determining what work should I do first. It's based on things like how important is it, how easy is it, what's the budget for it, what's the cost for it. There's a process for that within Scaled Agile, but it's an excellent prioritization mechanism that we support as a sorting feature you can see here within our backlog management system. Again, nice screenshot here showing product backlog. In Agile Manager, if you hover over any of these items or if you click on these items, you can get more detail. And a couple more examples of setting up the weighted shortest job first functionality. Again, it's optional for some organizations. You can see enable at the bottom there. If you're not doing Scaled Agile, if you're doing Scrum of Scrums or different ways of scaling, that's supported in our environment as well. Again, the goal isn't to force people to use the technology a certain way. There's a guided best practice that it comes out of the box with, but it's also recognizing that organizations develop their own culture and their own best practices, and we need to be able to support those within our technology, and we do. Again, some examples of the SAFe team and how we can actually pull some of the work out here, doing maybe a spike to actually test a certain piece of architectural functionality, maybe looking at a certain spike for our business functionality that we're doing. If you're familiar with Scaled Agile, the concept of a spike is pretty integral to a lot of that process. But again, we're managing some of the minutia within Agile Manager around who has capacity for work, what story points are being consumed, how many hours are being consumed by users. Is Matt overburdened if I give this work to him? And it's as simple as just dragging and dropping work to release, or dragging and dropping work to a team or to a person as far as the assignment. Again, I would strongly recommend, if anybody's interested, take a look at trying Agile Manager online. It's pretty easy to set it up, pretty easy to get very proficient out of the box. Some examples here showing the program increment and some of the sprints and how we actually look at some of that stuff. There is a Scrum mode as well. So if we're not doing anything specifically different, we just want to just use Scrum Agile out of the box. We can turn that on effectively within Agile Manager, and it focuses some of our best practices directly within the technology. Again, technology should be supporting us. We shouldn't have to conform to the technology. That's sort of my view on things. We also have Kanban mode if you're using that as well, or Scrumban if you're looking at that. And again, it sets our storyboards up based on that environment. You can see you can even talk about our working days at the very top here. Some organizations we've worked with will work 7 days at much shorter hours. Some organizations will work 5 days at regular hours. Again, that flexibility is supported inside here. And Kanban mode moves over to this idea of WIP, work in progress. You want to minimize the amount of work in progress. There's actually an excellent, again, on the Scaled Agile web site, there's a lot of interesting stuff around WIP and just organizationally how to manage that. I'm a huge fan of that stuff as well. Just a quick screenshot here of the Kanban mode itself and how we can actually start to look at what WIP we have out there. Excellent for planning. Very easy to set this up again, and depending on your role, you may have a different set of things that you're looking at inside here. One project could be using Kanban mode, the other project might be using Scrumban, and still able to share some of the information between them, including out in the Quality Center and the PPM if we need to do so. I'll push forward here because I wanted to leave room for questions. You know, my 2 cents, and that's certainly HP's perspective on things, and I've having done a lot of Agile projects myself in the past here, the sticky note thing is interesting, and it does work for some organizations, and I am in no way trying to demean that. It's just when you start to get to a larger enterprise or even a mid-sized company, you know, we had a joke at one of the companies I was working at, when the air conditioning came on and blew all the sticky notes off the wall, there's no more stories left, so we're done. I mean, it's obviously not really the case, but the idea is if we're using some of this technology on the board here versus some software to help facilitate this, the software is going to allow more people to participate in that process, and we don't want them necessarily changing things, but visibility isn't always a bad thing, especially organizations beginning to adopt Agile, because that's when you're going to stumble the most, and that's where we found getting executives visibility into something keeps people from getting really uncomfortable and keeps people from making very, very rash decisions on the project. So again, I would, if anybody's interested, I have huge recommendation to take a look at sas.hp.com. There's a link on there for Agile Manager. You can get your free trial going now. It's a 30-day free trial, full functionality inside there, and again, take a look at that here. And actually, sorry, we got the shortened link here as well, hpagilemanager.com as well if you want to take that up. At this stage here, I will pass it over. We'll do some Q&A.
All right, great. Hey, great presentation, Matt. That was a lot of informative information. We've had a number of questions come in since the beginning. So hopefully, you know, for the folks on the call and you, we can go over a little bit past 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to get through some of these questions. I think they're very important. The top question that came in was actually this. It says, do you see many offshore teams providing QA to co-located Agile teams? And if so, have you seen the synchronization between ALM and AGM work well, especially with the direct cover status attribute update that you described?
Yeah, so that's actually probably the biggest struggle I'm finding organizations having right now is when there is some sort of offshore work being done. And it's still pretty common. Actually, a lot of the offshore testing companies have become so proficient at it, organizations just can't help but use them because they're very good. But being able to actually have this direct cover status and having this work within the technology and the linkage does become very critical because you're having the technology manage the minutia, so I can actually focus on what I would call the productive work. They were using the term yesterday at the DevOps stage, which I thought was hilarious, the shaving the yak. Because all the work you got to get done in order to actually start doing the work you actually want to do. Like if I wanted to go downtown, I've got to start looking for parking. I've got to look at getting gas for my car and so forth. But my goal was to get downtown. All that other stuff that I've got to do is very well done inside the technology here, and it just allows the team to focus on other things.
Right. Good answer. And we have a number of questions that I've kind of clumped together into one. There was a lot of feedback or questions around, we hear a lot about water Scrum projects, you know, teams kind of on the fence, not quite pure Scrum, not quite traditionalist or waterfall. Architecturally speaking, between ALM and Agile Manager, there seems to be a lot of overlap. Wouldn't it make sense to combine the features and functionality of both products into one?
So that's also an excellent question. Yes. So actually, that's, I would argue, so Gartner's got this really interesting thing, the hype curve, they call it, and we're at probably the late stage or middle to late stage adoption, I would argue, of Agile into the enterprise. So you're starting to see it get broader adoption. With that, though, you're beginning to get organizations that just don't have an easy ability to do true Scrum. And that's just, sometimes culturally, it's just, that's a thing. I would argue that that's not bad necessarily as long as you're taking some of the core tenets into that process. And so ultimately, we, based on looking at our customer base, have recognized that and will be in the future. We announced that actually at Discover, looking to combine ALM and Agile Manager into a single product moving forward. It's a little bit further out, so it's a next year conversation likely. In the meantime, though, we are synchronizing a lot of these things directly together so that you can effectively work in the same environment. It's a tough argument, I think, for me to have an answer for on either side of that because I like the concept of having a tool that is tailored to the person using it, so I don't have to learn a very large environment potentially. But at the same time, having all that data in one environment and being able to not even do synchronization or need it in future, I think is also very valuable. So I think that is something you'll see coming from us probably in the next year or so, because our customers are just demanding it.
Okay, great. So those were two of the hardest questions, I would say, from the list that came in. I have a few kind of softball ones I'm going to throw at you now that came in as well. One participant asked, do we get a common dashboard for the burn down chart, velocity, and defects in Agile Manager?
Yeah, you do actually, yeah. So Agile Manager is, I would argue, about the user first and foremost. And what that means is when you log in, you can see your own custom sets of dashboards, but you can also see, call it the team prescribed default sets of dashboards as well. So yeah, definitely, it's pretty easy to have something that's standard across the organization, but we want to allow the flexibility, likely, and you can, I guess, turn it off if you needed to have each individual practitioner build out their own reports as well if they want to.
Okay, great. Another question came in too. This is with regards to functionality of ALM and Agile Manager and how they work in cohesion. The question is, if I were to create user stories in Agile Manager, can I transfer them to ALM or QC as requirements and then subsequently create the tests?
Definitely, yes. So the way the integration works, I think, best is that the user stories are created inside Agile Manager. The sync tool will then create those inside of ALM as requirements effectively. And then the easiest thing, if you're using Quality Center or ALM, is to just click on those requirements or right-click and then say create tests. And it creates a framework for your tests for that, and then it manages that coverage status in both Agile Manager and in Quality Center or ALM.
Okay, good. And there also seems to be quite a bit of interest around the direct coverage status attribute. One question that came in that I'll pull out of this bunch is the direct coverage direct coverage status, does that roll up to the feature level within Agile Manager, or is it just at the user story level?
No, so it's actually, well, the good news is all those different things, themes, features, and user stories can be transmitted into Agile, or ALM or to Quality Center. And the direct coverage status will fit to that. Well, we don't have a real easy ability today yet, I say yet, because we update functionality so quickly and regularly in Agile Manager, is to actually do some sort of a combined analysis of what's the quality across all of my theme or all of my feature. Now, you could indirectly do that inside of ALM or Quality Center because it would be a parent requirement, potentially, of children that would be the user stories. But at least today, you can do the transmission of the direct cover status. I argue there's some additional things we need to still add to that, and the team is likely working on that anyway.
Okay. I suppose that sort of relates to this other question too. Maybe we can expand upon this. A participant said, ALM's traceability and change impact analysis features are powerful, especially for regression testing. How do you foresee a QA team communicating to a Scrum team that additional regression test cases need to be executed outside of the user stories linked to the requirements in ALM? In other words, how are the results communicated back over to Agile Manager?
So that is an excellent question. So there's the philosophical answer, which I'll give, and they don't always work in practice, but philosophically, those should be conversations brought up during a stand-up meeting, or should be at least voiced with the person. That's what Agile is probably going to want best, because if we're talking about it just verbally or directly, it alleviates any of that, we call it distancing from things by just saying, oh, it's on a list somewhere. Well, we want to have that conversation with the team directly. However, in the technology, though, there are ways for us to communicate information back and forth. I've seen people add placeholder tests and then connect them up to user stories, for example, in ALM as a requirement. That transmits over to there. I've seen people use defects maybe as a way of transmitting tasks across. So we log a defect in Quality Center that really just ends up being a task that gets transmitted over to Agile Manager. There's not really a clean way, I'd argue, to do it today, but again, at some point you probably do want to have that conversation with the person or the team directly with it, because the further and further you get away from this idea of the Agile team working cohesively and all the time together on the same sort of stuff, the more likely you are to get larger deviations in work on the team.
Okay. Well, there are a number of questions flying in right now, so this one actually looks like another interesting one. One of our participants asked, how does the new Lean FT product fit into this overall equation?
That's a great question. So there isn't a direct integration with Lean FT and Agile Manager yet, and I'm not sure if the team is working on it at all right now. Lean FT is certainly targeted and is very, very, very well positioned towards the Agile team. It's a much lighter weight functional regression testing tool, multiple browser support, allows you to actually work from unit tests and move it into functional tests. I argue if you've used Selenium, it's Selenium++. It's very, very easy to use. That does integrate, though, Lean FT and Selenium, I guess, into Quality Center, into ALM. And so by way of connecting it into the ALM or Quality Center piece, it indirectly is connected to the user stories that are over in Agile Manager.
Okay, makes sense. Another question came in regarding the Kanban demonstration you provided with an Agile Manager. This participant says, using the Kanban mode in Agile Manager, is it possible to configure the task board so that it will have more states for each story that it's supposed to go through? He says, in my customer way of working, each story is going through one state in every sprint.
Okay. Well, so you can customize the Kanban board. You can add additional states if you need to. You can rename them if you need to. And yeah, I guess that process would even work. I mean, the Kanban board is really what you're using to organize your work in progress, to just make sure that the team doesn't get this massive backlog of stuff that's waiting to get done. Scaled Agile uses the example of, if you're in a line at Starbucks to get coffee, and the line's like 50 people deep. The fastest you'll ever get a new person served is probably 51. And so you always want to keep that number of people in the line as short as possible so you have more agility to accept new work if you need to do it. And so, yeah, we can fundamentally support those types of changes and configurations within our board to support additional states.
Absolutely. And I think this last question relates to the synchronization configuration capabilities of the tool between AGM and ALM. The participant says, HP ALM organizes requirements into folders, hierarchical structure. AGM has a flat structure. How does AGM requirements or user stories know which folder to correspond with over into ALM?
So there is a mapping process that can be done to do some of that. Out of the box, I believe, and I got to double check on this myself here, it's going to bring it all in as a relatively flat structure, but you can configure so much stuff with the synchronizer to create some of these different scenarios. I'd be surprised if there wasn't a way for us to do some sort of a folder structure, but offhand I'm not 100% sure.
Okay, great. There are a few other questions that unfortunately we cannot get to today. It's about 1:04 Eastern Standard Time right now. So what we're going to do is go ahead and wrap up this particular webinar. However, I'd like to let the participants know on the call that we will be sending an email out with the recording and the slides for this webinar. You should receive that from Vivid. In addition, I'd like to let everybody know that HP is going to go through these additional questions one by one and answer them for you in writing, and they're going to be posted to the Vivid portal. You'll also get an email notification indicating when those are available. So I want to take the opportunity to thank Matt for this great presentation around Agile Manager and HP ALM. We have some URLs up here. There will be a short survey sent to you as well. So please take the time to fill that out. We would appreciate it. And we look forward to hearing from you on future webinars. Thank you again.